All right, are we literally living through the end of Western civilization? I know, it's a massive question, but according to Dr. Augusto Zimmermann, who is an Australian law professor, the answer might be a resounding yes. In his highly provocative new book, The Battle for the Soul of Western Civilization, Zimmermann argues that the West isn't just changing, it's actually rapidly declining from the inside out. So in today's explainer, we're going to systematically map out exactly what he's claiming and look at his proposed solutions. Now, our goal here isn't to take a side, but simply to break down the core arguments of his book impartially so you can really understand the mechanics of his worldview.
To really grasp the sheer severity of Zimmermann's claims, we've got to look at his reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic. He literally described the era as living in an apocalypse. He expressed this absolute disbelief that people would, in his view anyway, enthusiastically support their oppressors. And this reaction perfectly sets the tone for his broader thesis, which is basically that Western citizens have become way too compliant, happily allowing their fundamental rights to be stripped away by authoritarian governments.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with his Western decline hypothesis, move into his thoughts on government tyranny and the crisis in education, then we'll tackle his controversial takes on immigration and culture, and finally, look at his ideas for restoring the rule of law.
So starting with part 1. The Western Decline Hypothesis, Analyzing the Collapse. Zimmermann asserts that Western nations aren't just shifting culturally, they are actively collapsing due to ideological subversion. When diagnosing this collapse, he points his finger directly at 4 major nations. Let's look at Canada first. He claims the country has fully embraced a culture of death, specifically pointing to their medical assistance in dying laws. He contrasts that with the government's heavy-handed response to the trucker protests, where bank accounts were literally frozen. Moving over to France, he argues their history of what he calls bad revolutions has set them on a direct path to modern collapse. Then there's the UK. He says they're betraying their Magna Carta roots, pointing out that citizens are now getting arrested just for reposting opinions on Facebook. And finally, his home of Australia. He intensely critiques its extreme lockdowns, high taxes, and what he calls a tall poppy syndrome, which is basically a cultural attitude that he believes actively despises achievement and independent thinking.
Now, Zimmermann doesn't see all these national declines as just some random coincidence. He's looking at the broader picture. He theorizes that globalist institutions like the UN, the WHO, the World Economic Forum are driving this simultaneous self-destruction from the top down. For example, he points to environmental policies like shutting down power plants in Germany as inherently self-destructive. He argues the West is the only civilization on Earth uniquely failing to protect its own cultural legacy. But he does note one huge unintended consequence. Because of social media, the ruling class no longer has a total monopoly on the mainstream narrative. People are talking back.
Moving on to part 2, Government Overreach and Tyranny, the Death of the Rule of Law. He uses the pandemic as his ultimate proof that an authoritarian political oligarchy has essentially hijacked the West. Here he draws a really stark contrast for us. He argues for a traditional rule of law, which is grounded in objective justice and protecting God-given, unalienable rights. But he claims we are currently stuck under a rule of tyrannical government. In this modern system, he argues that the worship of government has basically replaced Christianity. The government uses positive law, meaning laws just made up by humans, purely as a tool for oppression, demanding blind compliance. His main point here is that just because a government passes a law, absolutely does not mean that law equals justice.
And this brings us to a highly charged concept he uses to describe everyday citizens right now. He labels them the good Germans. Or actually, scratch that, it's more like the good Canadians in today's context. He defines these as people who just happily, unquestioningly comply with whatever an oppressive regime tells them. He thinks that, purely out of a desire to feel safe, average folks have become way too trusting. From his perspective, they are willingly handing over fundamental human rights, like bodily autonomy, just because some authority figure told them it was the moral thing to do.
Which leads us right into part 3, the crisis in education, from learning to indoctrination. To explain how we got to this point, Zimmermann points straight at modern universities.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this incredibly provocative statistic he throws out. Because of the massification of university, the push to send absolutely everyone to college, he claims the average IQ of a college grad has totally plummeted. Back in the 1940s, it was around 120. Today, he says it sits at just 102. To put that into perspective, 102 is basically just the average IQ of the general public.
He argues this has created a ruling class of quote-unquote elites who severely lack the intellectual rigor of the past.
And Zimmermann is actually drawing on his own first-hand experience as a law professor here. He claims universities are basically running like businesses now, prioritizing client satisfaction and things like gender studies over objective truth. He talks about being pressured by university admins to pass unqualified students, even folks who struggled to speak or write basic English, just to keep fail rates low and revenue rolling in. According to his critique, these entirely unqualified students are being pushed through the system and are ending up as our lawyers, judges, and politicians.
All right, on to part 4, immigration and cultural shifts, the multiculturalism debate. He argues this massive ideological shift in education has paved the way for radical demographic changes.
In Chapter 9, he tackles what he sees as the absolute weaponization of the word racism. He calls it the most abused word in modern political discourse, used strategically by elites to totally shut down any rational debate about mass immigration. Take Australia, for instance, bringing in over 500,000 migrants in a single year. You can't even debate the impact that has on housing or infrastructure without being labeled. He contends that political oligarchs are deliberately importing voters who do not share Western traditions of fundamental rights. On top of that, he argues that multiculturalism is dangerous because it destroys objective moral standards and deliberately tears down the nuclear family unit.
But out of all this doom and gloom, he makes a really fascinating prediction. He specifically points to Generation Z young men. According to his analysis, these guys are growing incredibly disillusioned by a lost economic future, a broken family structure, and what he sees as anti-male laws. Because they feel like they literally have nothing left to lose, he says, they are becoming completely immune to labels like racist or sexist. As a result, he predicts Gen Z boys are going to be the ones to lead a fierce, reactionary pushback against all these globalist cultural shifts. Okay, so how does he suggest we fix this? That brings us to Part 5, Restoring the Rule of Law, a path forward.
The entire foundation of his solution relies on getting back to natural law. Drawing heavily on the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, Zimmermann argues that an unjust law is, at the end of the day, no law at all. He firmly believes the West has to remember that fundamental rights are God-given and unalienable. This is absolutely crucial to his whole framework. Why? Because if the government simply gives you your rights, well, the government can just as easily take them away. For him, real law protects human dignity. It doesn't crush it.
And this brilliantly illustrates what he thinks needs to happen in the real world. He lays out these radical, concrete steps for institutional reform, specifically looking at Australia. Step 1, replace 99% of the current political class. He thinks they're just hopelessly compromised. Step 2, privatize the state-owned broadcasting network, which he sees as pure propaganda. Step 3, enforce a rigid, strict separation of powers, which he argues doesn't even really exist in Australia right now. And Step 4, appoint actual experts as ministers. Maybe have a literal medical doctor serve as the health minister instead of a career politician.
Wow, okay, we've covered a massive amount of ground today. We mapped out a worldview that is intense, uncompromising, and highly critical of the modern West. So, we're going to leave you with this final thought to consider. Are Zimmermann's severe critiques a necessary wake-up call for the very survival of Western freedoms? Or are these claims merely the symptoms of an increasingly polarized and fractured political landscape? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the world around you.